Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's program of discussions with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Graneri, and all of us at FPRI thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. The world's largest democracy also happens to include one of the world's oldest civilizations. Yet India has not yet achieved a level of international status and influence commensurate with either its size or its history. Since independence from British imperial rule in 1947, leaders in New Delhi have tried to redress that imbalance. Policy specifics have varied from the moralistic neutralism of Nehru to assertive Hindu nationalism a la Modi, but the goal remains. Today, as the unipolar world order gives way to a multipolar future, and debates over the next world order have become especially insistent, India has a real chance to ascend to the status it has long sought. Will India succeed? In his new book, The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status, from Nehru to Modi, Professor T.V. Paul presents the Indian approach to world order with a combination of historical insight and contemporary analysis. He casts a sympathetic but critical eye upon New Delhi's efforts and the complex interplay between geopolitics and domestic arrangements. India is a nuclear power that has sent probes to the moon and to Mars, but still struggles to make its influence felt when it matters, especially in the face of a rivalry with the People's Republic of China that will likely shape the 21st century. One of the biggest obstacles lies within India itself. As Professor Paul writes, quote, "There is rhetoric on status among the Indian elite, aiming to convince Indians that the world thinks highly of them. But they have made inadequate efforts to mobilize Indian society in a way that would actually heighten India's status abroad," close quote. So how does India see its place in the world? What are India's ambitions? What internal and external factors help shape India's efforts to meet them? These questions, and yours, will guide us in conversation today with Professor T.V. Paul. T.V. Paul is James McGill Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He served as the president of the International Studies Association and also the founding director of the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change. He is the author or editor of 22 books, co-editor of 4 special journal issues, and author of over 80 scholarly articles and book chapters in the fields of international relations, international security, and South Asia, and currently serves as the editor of the Georgetown University Press series, South Asia in World Affairs. He is a very busy man, but we are delighted that he took the time to join us here today. Welcome to People, Politics, and Prose, Professor Paul.
Thanks a lot for having me. This is a very impressive forum. I know about it.
Great. So I want to start with a general question. What led you to write this particular book at this particular time? Is it the culmination of a research agenda, or is it guided by contemporary events, or both?
Both. Partly because I have been a student of international relations and Indian politics for over 40 years. And I have accumulated quite a bit of materials and ideas about India's trajectory. But what I noticed was that much of the writings about India's rise or constraints do not go into the socio-psychological aspects of it. And that is relating to the question of status in international politics, which assumes that there is some form of a hierarchy in international politics. And the ones that have the material and soft power capabilities could aim to achieve a top ranking position in that hierarchical system. So India has been under colonial rule for 200 years. Before that, for 800 years, off and on Muslim ruler invasions. One of them, of course, the Mughal Empire, was one of the richest in the world at that time. And it was a major contributor to human civilization. The most recent book book on the question of the Golden Road, William Dalrymple, worth reading, how ancient India shaped the world from 250 BC to 1500 BC. So since the arrival of the colonial rule, India has sort of a category of fallen people in the sense it lost its predominant position in the region and economic position too. So after independence, Jawaharlal Nehru was the first prime minister, thought that India should use its soft power, that is, its civilization, its diplomatic skills, and its newly emerged role as the leading state in the global south, that's the Afro-Asian countries. So it did institutional ways to achieve some level of importance in world politics. And but that changed once Indira Gandhi came to power, and then the conflict with Pakistan and China, and Pakistan being kind of adopted by the West, especially the United States, in the Cold War contest. And then Mr. Nehru adopted what you call a non-aligned policy, which is not to be part of any alignment. And then, but Indira Gandhi was rather forced to form a quasi-alliance with the Soviet Union in the face of US-China-Pakistan alliance in the 1970s. And then India tested nuclear weapons, but didn't do much until 1998. And then that test produced a lot of negative outcomes. But in 1991, India clearly liberalized its economy and started to show considerable growth, and averaging 6 to 7%. Today it is, in fact, yesterday there was a report that next year it will overtake Japan as the fourth largest economy in the world, and the following year Germany as the third largest economy of the world. In nominal numbers, actually in purchasing power parity, it's already number 3. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But as I show in the book, that's very much a different picture because the inequalities are very high in India. But in any case, with the BJP, that's the Hindu group that came to power, especially under Mr. Narendra Modi in 2014 onwards, they have been making a very forced pitch on India assuming or gaining a major power status. And so I noticed there is a domestic angle to it. There is an international angle to it. Then befriending the US, Japan, Australia, etc. In that same process, you are alienating China, which is a very pivotal state for India's position in the Indo-Pacific today. So I think we can go into the details if you have more on those questions.
Absolutely. No, and there are a couple of different angles that I want to approach here. I want to start with the historical one, and that is that Nehru pursued a notion of India's importance in the world that was built around neutralism, non-alignment, representing the global South, equidistance between the superpowers, and also relied very heavily, one could argue, on the moral force of India's independence. At what point, I mean, because the irony is, as you point out, right, Indira Gandhi, when she becomes prime minister, takes a slightly different approach. But she is Nehru's daughter. And so I'm curious about at what point does India find that the initial neutralist, non-aligned moral force effort for international status has run its course?
Right. So Nehru had a reason for that. India didn't have much material strength, but it has all these other strengths. And Nehru was philosophically against use of force, if possible, although he did use force in a few occasions. But the biggest challenge for India was that its conflicts with Pakistan over Kashmir and its conflict with China over the undemarcated line of actual control all were generating a lot of conflict externally. Mm-hmm. And internally, there was considerable struggles for feeding the population in the 60s. Right. So the US policies started to become rather hostile to Indira Gandhi's period, in particular under Johnson, for instance. Johnson thought India shouldn't make any noise about Vietnam War, and therefore Johnson, US was offering food aid to India under PL 480, and there was an effort to restrict that, and that clearly irritated the Indian leadership. But the biggest change was the US under Nixon and Kissinger going to China to befriend China with a larger purpose of containing the Soviet Union or balancing the Soviet Union with the help of Pakistan. And that really was the starting point. Mrs. Gandhi fought a war with Pakistan in 1971. And US and Pakistan, of course, US and China opposed that Indian intervention. US sent under Nixon um, the task force, naval task force to Bay of Bengal, tried to coerce India, didn't work out. Bangladesh was liberated. Bangladesh was East Pakistan. And since then, and in 1974, India tested a nuclear bomb. Materials were given by the US and Canada, not the bomb itself, but the uranium and plutonium, etc. And that generated a lot of hostility in the US. There was an act, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, the Carter administration proposed. India was under sanctions. So this transformation was perceptually also became very difficult. US had great difficulty understanding the Indian security needs. US was providing materials, support, weapons to Pakistan under a military rule. And then, of course, the Afghan crisis, that's a pivotal thing, 1979, that further caused great problems for India as the US now adopts Pakistan as a frontline state.
Well, and I would say this is the one paradox of this relationship. As we talk about India and the United States are the world's two largest democracies. And yet, for most of their joint existence as independent states, they have not been allies.
They will not be allies, but at least friends.
or well, and their, let's say that their friendship has been a rocky one, right? That the United States has, for geopolitical reasons, tilted towards Pakistan.
Yes.
At what point that relationship is somewhat different now? I mean, in the sense that I think it's better now, certainly than it was. Much better, much different. And so, one of the things that I wonder about, and we're talking mostly about India, not about Pakistan here, but I am curious to the extent to which the Pakistanis sort of failed in their alliance with the United States in Afghanistan, whether the breakup of U.S.-Pakistani relations over Afghanistan has contributed to the American tilt back towards India.
Contributed, not necessarily the sole reason. So India and Pakistan were equal in the strategic conceptions of the US and the West. It's always India-Pakistan parity. Right. That was broken after the Kargil conflict in 1999, when President Clinton forced Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to withdraw from occupied Kargil areas, Pakistan army. And then there was a coup, and then, of course, the next Afghan war opens up opportunities. But under President Bush, George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice, there was a great effort to befriend India. And they realized that the nuclear issue is the #1 issue that's prohibiting that. So that's why they signed a nuclear treaty or agreement with India, under which India was now treated as a quasi-nuclear state without really removing its capabilities, but with some restrictions. And in return, US will try to sell civilian reactors, so to contain Indian nuclear capability. But it was a big accommodation because no other power, even Israel, is accommodated like that by the United States. So I call it a status accommodation. Indeed, I have a quote from an interview I had with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Why did you sign that agreement? He said, to remove the nuclear apartheid from us. So it's not just any material benefit, it's also a status issue. Right. So the US since then has been treating India as a swing power in the context of rise of China, and that it has formed several agreements or groups. There's one called Quad, Quadrilateral Dialogue with Australia, Japan, and India. There is also G20 and a series of efforts to, there is an annual dialogue. All this removed some of the perceptual difficulties they had. There's a lot to do with perceptions. US leaders in general had a different perception than, let's say, the Soviet leaders had during the Cold War, where the leaders of India viewed themselves as a leading global South power, but the US looked at it as a hostile kind of relationship. But then, of course, the demographic major infusion of Indian talent to American universities and Silicon Valley, something like 40% are now Indian expatriates. The contribution to American economy and the corporations and the technological advancements. Then, of course, a lot of political positions, including Kamala Harris, if you want to call her partly Indian. But the point is, there is a much different perception on India's status, potential, and leaders, including Prime Minister, I mean, including President Obama, saying that India has arrived, not just
Mm-hmm.
arriving.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a general consensus in the US, both Republicans and Democrats. India is needed. Even if it doesn't form an alliance, it is a good balancing force in a different way.
Well, and that I think which gets at the crucial relationship between India and the People's Republic of China, right? So from the perspective of the United States, India is important as a potential, as you say, a swing state or a balancer against Beijing. But the Indians, of course, have their own complex relationship with China, as you pointed out, right? They fought wars going back to 1962 with the Chinese. And yet, as part of the developing world or the global South more broadly, the Indians have sought forms of cooperation with China, right? I think about the BRICS, for example. And I am curious how say the Modi government, but also how governments over the past couple of decades, how they have viewed the balance between the rivalry with China, but also the desire to cooperate with China in the name of the interests of Asian states or the interests of the global South.
So that's a paradox here.
Mm.
India actually calls its policy multi-alignment. It's not alignment per se, but multi-pronged. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, it doesn't want to completely alienate China, partly because China and India agree on many global commons issues, climate change to some trade issues, used to be much more together.
Mm.
So they have an interest in bargaining with the ruling Western coalitions. And they have done that in many meetings. But that has now declined, by the way, because China is, at that time, China was willing, before Xi Jinping, willing to share India some level of status. And so this
Mm-hmm.
association they created, BRICS, actually is quite an interesting, somewhat democratic association. That China is not supreme there, or none of the partners. So India wanted that, but then China is now pushing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is very much a Chinese-driven initiative. And India will, if it joins, will be a second-class partner, and
Mm.
China will gain more. That's the fear because of its advantages in marketing its products. So this relationship gotten worse because Xi Jinping started pushing border issues, which was dormant for a period of time. And then there were two or three clashes, 2017, 2020, 2021, 22. And so a few areas where there was one clash in Ladakh where 20 Indian soldiers got killed, an undetermined number of Chinese too.
Mm-hmm.
And this really showed that there is tension. But what is interesting is those 20 were killed not by firearms, but by non-lethal weapons, sticks and brooms and things. They're pushed into a lake. So there is
Yes,
a,
it's which is a very odd. You talk about paradox, a very paradoxical conflict in the modern world.
yes, I think they are trying their best, actually, even to give some credit to China. Just
Mm.
recently, they came to an agreement whereby they're pulling back some of these forward deployed troops. But largely for reasons that there is a conference of BRICS, not BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Council and
Mm-hmm.
others happening. And so they want India to participate. And also G20 is coming up. And so China has institutional aims and it wants to bring India in there and not to create any problems there. But more
See,
than that,
oh, no, please go ahead.
more than that, it is also a balancing game. It's called soft balancing. That
Mm-hmm.
the India is not fully comfortable with the West completely joining them. That also alienating China is challenging because then the border tensions China could ratchet up the border tension. And China is already very active in the Indian Ocean region with all the South Asian countries are trading with China. So if China pushes hard, it can really take away some of the influence that India has in these smaller South Asian states. So it's a balancing act. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they succeed. Much more interesting is the trade balance between the two. India's largest trading partner, at least last year, was China. And the
Hmm.
largest amount of it's a hugely imbalanced trade in favor of China. India doesn't export much to China, but it imports over $150 billion worth of trade
Is
annually.
it largely industrial goods and finished goods they import from China,
It's
or
industrial components,
industrial
as far
components?
as I know. And then, of course, manufactured cheap products. But the
Hmm.
industrial components are necessary for Indian manufacturing,
Hmm.
including pharmaceuticals and all the
Hmm.
things that India exports. And
Right.
actually, it's probably true with the Western companies too. So this is where China has a big hold on India. It cannot really easily cut out that. So there is a kind of interdependence, of
Hmm.
course, asymmetrical in favor of China. But India really cannot cut off completely without a second source, and that source is either Taiwan or it's not big enough for these needs at this point.
Right. Well, and I guess this is part of the larger problem of international relations in the 21st century, right? The degree of economic interdependence. Obviously we talk about this with the United States and the Chinese, but this of course brings up the issue of that other state in the BRICS, and that is Russia. Um, India's relationship with the Soviet Union had particular historical roots in the Cold War, in Indian neutralism. India's relationship with Russia today has caused some friction with the West because the Indians have been very cautious in their criticisms of Russia's imperial war in Ukraine. And so India finds itself torn between wanting to be on the side of let's say on the side of colonial peoples against imperial masters, but
Mm.
also finds themselves in a friendly relationship with Russia. How does how do the Indians today imagine their relationship with Russia developing both through this war, but even after it's over?
So India wants a multipolar world
Hmm.
in which India will be a pole too. It doesn't want Russia to completely collapse or lose its status as a great power because it realizes that historically Russia has been on India's side whenever it
Hmm.
needed help, Russia and Soviet Union.
Right.
At least 6 or 7 vetoes in the Security Council whenever there were conflicts where India was sanctioned or had to face the Security Council resolutions. More than that, the Soviet Union had a very special relationship with India. They treated Indian leaders with respect and status,
Uh-huh.
unlike the Western countries. So there is that feeling that even though this is a poor country, but it represents the global South, it's a big civilization. The Russians understood that the psychological need of Indian elite, which the
Hmm.
US had great trouble accepting. That changed, by the way. I think that is the reason why the relationship is much better today. In fact, they were given opportunity to speak at the Congress or give special dinners at White House, rarely given to foreign rulers. Um, so India is very uncomfortable with the war, which is very true. It's gaining a little bit, getting the oil, unrefined oil, refine it, and then actually is exporting to Europe quite a
Hmm.
bit of that, which is a paradox too.
Yes, it is.
But it is now making some efforts to connect President Zelensky and Putin's positions. I don't think it's making much inroads. But the point is that this is one area where maybe there is a little bit more sensitivity was needed on the Indian side, especially Prime Minister visiting Moscow, and so that was missing. But at the same time, the Indian position is this war is an aberration. It should be ending or should be ended soon, and we need to bring Russia back into its old position. And secondly, there is also a group of people who believe that Russia was forced into this war because of the Western expansion of NATO, etc.
Hmm.
And that it's not a mistake that Russia needs this sphere of influence, which is actually, again, problematic from an old Indian position on sovereign equality, etc. But
Hmm.
under Mr. Modi, his realpolitik is more important. So they're playing a game which US doesn't seem to have that much of a problem because the relationship is very much based on gas and oil. It doesn't, I mean, even if you put a sanction on it, the European oil price will go up. India
Hmm.
will have a tough time compensating for that oil. That's another problem.
I mean, that's the problem, right? Is that
Yeah.
that's where India has traditionally gotten much of its oil from Russia,
From
and so they couldn't suddenly
some, but no, from Persian Gulf too. But
from the Persian Gulf.
every time India imports some 70% of its oil needs.
Yeah.
Oil price going up is will make a dent on its GDP and also
Mhm.
its own ability to spend on other things. So, but India could explain these things a little better way. Doesn't
Mhm.
have to do things and then the West or Americans and interpret it in such a way. I think the hope is that this war will come to an end and things will go back. At that point, India needs Russia. Russia is a supporter of India's membership in the UN Security Council, and Putin has been playing it quite safely with Mr. Modi.
Hmm. Well, and your answer suggested a couple of other issues to bring up. One is the relationship of India to the Persian Gulf and to the
Mm.
states of the Gulf, and in the Middle East. And that I know that India's relationship with the Gulf monarchies, India's relationship with Israel. These are complicated relationships as well. Places where India can play an important role as a regional power. But
Mm.
now, with war going on in the Middle East, how is the current war in Gaza and Lebanon influencing Indian foreign policy?
Actually, I want to add one more point on this Russia issue.
Go right
India
ahead.
does not want, after that I will answer your question. India
Hmm.
does not want Russia-China alliance, which is very
Mm,
important
right.
for India, because that will hurt India in a massive way. So I think this is the reason why even the US is reasonably sensitive to that. The
Hmm.
pushing Russia into the Chinese orbit would make India's security environment really harsh and will not be any improvement. And the West cannot compensate for that loss. But coming to the Persian Gulf, yeah, under Mr. Modi in particular, it has been going on. These countries have become much more, they realize that friendly because they realize that their biggest source of human labor force and increasingly oil exports is India. And they
Hmm.
import a lot of materials and traffic going on, airlines and whatnot. And that they cannot alienate this country, whatever position it takes. But the problem is they themselves are not playing any role in the current Middle East context.
Hmm.
They are all sort of buck passing, and India is doing that too. And
Hmm.
India has this, under Mr. Modi, a very anti-Muslim attitude. So he doesn't want to support any insurgencies, groups like Hezbollah. That would show that in India itself, you have Kashmiri insurgencies. But his position on Israel has been improving. But I think many Indians are uncomfortable with the level of violence that Israel is inflicting on the enemies. But the point
Hmm.
is, Israel they view as a source of high-tech weapons, political support, and a way to reach the US, which is an interesting part.
Right? Is
So
a way to
there
reach
are,
the US. Absolutely.
because the Israelis at least traditionally had better relations with the West, and that there is cooperation going on, and a lot of Israeli tourists, by the way, go to India,
They
especially
do.
those
Oh, I
who
did.
serve in the army. They take their vacation in India or the 1 year they get after serving. So there is a lot of things going on, but on the other hand, this conflict is also bad for India because whenever you have this kind of potential for conflict and violence, any increase in oil price, for instance, or Iran, by the way, India has a traditional relationship. It doesn't want that.
I was about to wonder about that as well. That the
It
Iran
doesn't want.
is an old friend.
Yeah, it doesn't want Iran to go down because
Hmm.
Iran is needed for balancing Pakistan too.
Hmm.
It doesn't agree with everything that Iran does, but the point is there is that relationship. So it's a very multifaceted problem. And
Right.
India is not alone. Which country is taking a lead and effectively playing the game? The
Right.
world order is crumbling, and we don't have leaders at this point.
And there you go. That's what I was thinking about exactly. Is on the one hand, right, the crumbling of a rigid world order is something that India has wanted, right, because they want to be part of a different world order. But the challenge of how do you actually shape such a world order, right? Who's going to do the shaping
Yeah.
is a difficult question. And the question for India of which organizations should India join and try to work within versus staying outside of organizations and trying to pursue national interests. I want to come back to that, but also I want you to put your constructivist political scientist hat on for just a moment.
I'm not a
I know you're
constructivist.
not a constructivist, but I'm gonna ask you a constructivist question because we talk about interests,
Mm.
and yet the book is about status, which is related to material interests, but also has, let's say, non-material elements to it, right? It's about how
Yes.
you feel. So that's where I get to my joke about constructivism. Is it's one thing to act like a great power, or to feel that you're, or to think you have interest like a great power, but the desire for other people to view you as a great power, that can be a maddening pursuit, because how do you actually control how people view you? And
Yes.
how open are the Indians about talking about this quest among
Mm.
themselves, and how do they balance the material and the non-material pursuit of status?
Yeah, so I think the BJP fellows somehow uh, use this as also, by the way, for vote getting.
Mm.
There is
Hmm.
a rising middle class that wants India to be respected in the world order.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
sure.
and diaspora too. So it is really a selling point for them that we are the ones pushing India to gain acceptance. Acceptance in clubs of the world, membership in Security Council or any other key decision-making forum, where India will be heard. But you
Mm.
rightly put the question, actually it's relevant to China too. Neither of them has put forward a vision other than simply saying, for China, now it is a bipolar order, but then of course, a unipolar order led by China in 2049, if they somehow assume that the US will decline and then they
Right.
will somehow become the lead power. India is actually interested in reformed liberal order, world order, not necessarily internally, because it finds that the reform liberal order would give it more voice, and that voice it can probably channel for more status. So
Hmm.
status is a highly politicized concept. They don't understand the idea that you just mentioned. One can claim status like beauty, but others have to accept it. And that
Right.
acceptance is always a challenge. In the past, it's led to wars.
Hmm.
And the wars are often brutal if status is not accommodated. So
Right.
in India's case, they have come a long way. Remember, they were not treated anywhere closer to what they are. Materially, they are growing economically. But that growth is, as I call the title, the unfinished quest, because it requires institutional memberships. It requires a much better strategic orientation on India's side. What do you want? And that question, they don't have an answer other than we want members, membership.
Hmm. Hmm.
So world order, okay. Nehru had a vision, by the way, or others before that. But this idea is difficult because they think that it is better to wait and see how things evolve.
Hmm.
But if you look at the Hindu groups, they have a very traditional understanding great power status, European, a little bit driven by the fascist ideas too. But the problem for them is that they don't realize in the 21st century, this process is more cumbersome. The world is more democratic, and it's not going to be even easy to get a UN Security Council without other smaller states agreeing, because they can veto in the General Assembly. So there is a lot of not veto, oppose it in the General Assembly. So there are a lot of challenges there. But the point is that there is one group that believes that if your economy becomes number two, as they are predicting by 2050, India cannot be ignored.
Hmm.
And that's a claim that they just wait and see. They all need us. But that is not enough. You can be a very powerful, wealthy man, but you're not being treated well because you're not playing the game well. So I think it requires more than wealth, aggregate wealth. And
Hmm.
I argue that India's challenge is internal, partly because it's not developing the way it should be.
Hmm.
There's huge inequalities, and it's not addressing the human development issues as fast as it should be. And it's not utilizing the so-called demographic dividend, which is the population 19 to 50, the working population, which is highest in the world, by giving them skill sets and training and job opportunities. So if you do all that, then you become a major player in the world, because your workforce will be in high demand globally, because the workforce in many countries are declining. Even without that, your workforce is in demand, and that you have a lot of opportunities to build relationships with a lot of countries.
This is an excellent point. I'm glad we bring up the domestic issue because Ben Pributok has a question where he asks about, especially in India, seeing the problems of housing and public infrastructure, which relates to this larger issue that you bring up in the book, the attention that Indian governments have or have not paid towards domestic development and towards strengthening the nation from within in order to play an international role. What do you think is, I mean, outside of the fact that India is, of course, just a gigantic country with 1 billion+ people, but there are going to be challenges. But what is holding Indian governments back from making the kinds of investments and developments in domestic strengthening that you see as necessary for India to achieve the global status it seeks?
So they have priorities. They are actually building a lot of infrastructure, ports and highway roads, and um, they have made a lot of progress in these big ticket items. They put money into nuclear research, space research. Actually, it is paying dividends to India. It's actually the fourth or fifth best space power in the world today. As you said, sending spacecraft to Moon and Mars and landing them there. But the problem is they have spent 2% of their GDP on education and 1% on higher education and 1% of the rest. They have neglected this education, mass education. All developed countries, all countries in East Asia that became developmental states spend at least 7 to 8% on education. Healthcare, the same thing. India spends a paltry sum of less than 3% of GDP. All this partly because of the bureaucratic, and there is a cost element to that too, which makes some states, actually southern states have done much better, but the northern states have this problem of spending where it should be because they seem to have other priorities. And the demand is not there. The problem with Indian democracy is that let's say 5 year, there's an election. They make promises, but nobody is checking on what they made the promise with, what they did. And part of the reason is to win election, people have to be in the right caste and connections, not necessarily performance. Modi has changed a little bit of that, showing performance is important to re-election. But it's a problem with the Indian democracy that it is not pressuring enough the bureaucratic and political class to make the necessary changes in economic priorities. The other problem is the skewed nature of India's growth. Some 10% of the people hold 50% of the wealth of the country, and India produces more billionaires than even China today every year. And that wealth is concentrated, and some of them, they do employ, but they're not employing enough, the Ambanis and the Adanis, to bring up the large number of unemployed youth in Indian setup. But some states in India, like Kerala or Tamil Nadu is a most recent case, they are doing very well in social development, partly because they are putting a lot of emphasis on education and healthcare. Tamil Nadu in attracting a lot of companies, including Apple. Now, Apple's main production line is there, or foreign car companies. But the northern Indian states have this problem, and that is a cultural element, and it's a deep-rooted challenge how to make them realize they need more attention on quality education, quality healthcare.
Well, as you point out, right, the interesting tension that on the one hand, part of India's soft power could be presenting itself as this vast, fascinating, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious community, and yet you have a government that is aggressively trying to push a particular vision of a Hindu India, and almost an illiberal India. And so there's a tension between the face of India that actually is appealing to the outside world versus the face that is being presented by the government. But related to that as well, you talk about Indian democracy, is Prime Minister Modi is pretty popular, but he did suffer surprising losses in the most recent elections, right? He still has his majority, but it is smaller than it had been. What is the future for Modi's particular vision of Hindu India?
The election showed that overwhelming majority of Indians are not for that particular vision of Hindu in-your-face religious nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
They are becoming more sympathetic to the idea that Hindus have been on the receiving end for a long time. There is
Mm-hmm.
time that we assert ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But there is tolerance in India. I mean, that's the interesting part of the Indian civilization. It has historically been tolerant to many different groups. That's how all these people ended up there, no? Christians, Jews, and Muslims to some extent.
Right.
But this idea of a Hindu Rashtra coming out of, Rashtra means country, out of a civilizational past, what can it offer for the future is not properly addressed. Who is going to emulate you? What
Mm-hmm.
kind of model you're going to create? Uh, Using all these religious texts to show that we did this thing, that thing is not enough. Can you provide solutions to modern day problems? And they don't have an answer to that. But it is a great force of unifying force for at least for the party. And Mr. Modi has certain personal attributes that really help him to sell it. I think it has limitations like all populism, and I
Mm-hmm.
truly believe that, including American Trump populism, they fail eventually because they cannot solve the main problems of the place. For a short period, tactical gains, they will do a few things and then you think that, okay, the economy is doing okay. But over time, the Indian case now a huge youth unemployment, and there's no
Mm-hmm.
policy to address that. And they are disgruntled, their families are unhappy, even though before they might have voted for BJP, and now they are saying that we need more than that, we need employment. So Modi has tried to compensate by giving more welfare schemes and direct transfer of payments, etc. None of that is going to solve this underlying desire for social mobility and upward mobility. I
Mm-hmm.
think in a sense, the BJP has done some good things, I must say, building upon the previous Congress regime's achievements, and even internationally quite a bit because the astute diplomacy they pursue in some areas, with the foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, with a lot of international training. You know, he was a diplomat before, and with education and international relations, so that helps. But the point is that alone is not enough. They have to really develop all groups in India, including Muslims, and
Mm-hmm.
subjugating them is not going to answer the problems
Mm-hmm.
because then they will join the lower class people for a very disgruntled group. And they are about 14% of the population. And
Right.
so, how to make everybody benefit from this growth of this country is a challenge. But I think it's a matter of branding and engaging different groups. And then, of course, the world has to pay attention to this kind of fascist tendencies in many parts of the world, including the West. And there is that tendency among them, those kind of populists, to converge and agree on things. And I think it is, we are going through that phase, if, especially if Mr. Trump wins this election, that will be a major blow for democracy in the world. And I think the key is democratic revival requires a global effort and failure of the so-called populists.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's yet to be seen how long that will take.
Well, what it is the challenge of populism is populism often addresses real problems, but all offers imaginary solutions to real problems, which ultimately catches up with them. The problem is
Mm.
that ultimately part can be a long time,
That's the
right?
thing, yeah.
Well, but when you talk about the influence of different groups and the sort of Indian cultural influence, right? A huge piece of that is the Indian diaspora, and the idea that you have a diaspora throughout the Indian Ocean region that goes back millennia.
Mm.
But then you also have a substantial Indian diaspora in North America. And if you don't mind me asking, framing this in personal ways, is like your own. I'm curious about your own experience, right? You said that you came to UCLA to study political science 30 years ago. Um, uh,
More than
More
30.
than that's right. But we'll elide that. Let's say at least 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But I am curious your experience as an Indian living in North America, first in Los Angeles, now in Montreal. Um, how have you seen the visibility and the potential influence of the Indian diaspora change even within your lifetime?
Substantially improved.
Yeah.
When I was a student at UCLA, India was also having this conflict on nuclear issues, and
Right.
there was a lot of hostility towards India, and it reflected in seminars. I also studied nuclear issues.
Okay.
That has changed substantially today. There are at least universities where some attention is given. And even in Canada, there was a sort of a, let's say, racism when I arrived here,
Well, yeah, for sure.
looking upon Indians as, why are you here kind of look. That wasn't the case in Los Angeles, though, I must say. Indians were already settled there. And that has changed quite a bit. In Canada, it's actually a big minority Indians and doing quite well in many areas, except that we have a problem with the Khalistan issue, and
Mm,
Canada is having a tough time. But in the US, I think also the arrival of the technocratic group, technical group, and then many Indian educated people assuming leadership roles in US corporations, that this minority in general is a model minority, now the wealthiest group. So all that happened during that 30, 40 years, and a lot of connections to India as a result. And I
right.
think it's the Indian educational system, if you go to a decent school, pushes you to learn basics. And then India has some fine technical institutions like the IITs and IITs, Institute of Technologies and Institute of Management. If you get a degree from there, that training, and then you come and do a PhD in the US. In my case, it was my JNU, which is Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, where I studied my MPhil, and then I came to the US. That's a great combination because you get some basics there, and then you have the American freedom and the ability to understand different nuanced points. And so we work very hard, at least a segment of it. And
Right.
then you assume university positions. So it has been a great experience for me watching the growth of this diaspora. But I also see the diaspora is divided on this Hindu nationalism, for instance. A group of them are still in a status humiliated position. Our religion is not treated well, therefore we should assert. Even when they are enjoying the liberal freedoms, they are ready to take away that back in India
Hmm.
for the minorities. So that really bothers me, but I think that's only a certain segment. So that group is mostly technical, educated people who are not tuned to the liberal ideas or that requires some engagement. But
Right.
overall, the story of Indian diaspora's position, actually, if you look at status, their status ranking has improved substantially globally, even
Right.
though India's status has not simultaneously grown as much as it could have been.
Right. Well, and that's what I am very curious. When you decided to come to the United States, to go to the United States to study,
Mhm.
you clearly there was a path for Indians to study in the United States. I have friends I've known for a long time in the academic biz who also came to the United States for their PhDs. But when you did, would you say this was still something considered to be rather daring and unusual, or and that path has become more well trod perhaps lately than it was then?
It wasn't unusual since the 60s. People were
Hmm.
coming in. Kamala Harris's mother came in the
For
60s, and
example.
yeah, for example. But it still required some real personal initiative. In
Hmm.
my case, I was a journalist in Delhi. I would go to the American Information Service, get all the papers on which university offers what programs. There's no internet, no. So you then write to them. They send you this big packets. You have to go through and then do some GRE, all these things. It's a challenge for a villager at that time or coming
Hmm.
from a small town. But in Delhi, it was possible. So you have to be in the central of India,
Hmm.
central capital of India. That has changed, which is what internet did. So
Hmm.
people from villages can apply to American schools. And now a lot of undergraduates and graduates alone, master's students are coming in. That wasn't the case at that time. Most of the arrivals were PhD students. And
Right.
then that's why many of them ended up in university system. But the massive number of masters in engineering subjects and computer engineering in particular transformed that arrival. And many of them are employed in multinational companies in the US and even in India.
Right.
So,
And
yeah.
I would say these are exactly the sorts of things that do sort of raise the status of India's global profile, right? That there is
So
a sense that Indians
that
matter.
is what people like me always wish. If India did more for the improvement of its own youth, educational, all the things I talk about in the book,
Right.
it will increase my status. as an Indian person of Indian origin. I'm a
Right.
Canadian citizen, but the fact that it's still you still want your country you left do well and respected, but not exactly the same reasons that some people think. This muscular nationalism, chest thumping ideas, or religious persecution. I would rather see India a prosperous, respected country for its multiculturalism, for its democratic values, tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
It has this enormous capacity to be tolerant to different groups and the great things that India contributed to the world. So respect for India is respect for me as a person,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So, but not exactly the same way every group in India now is projecting.
Right. Well, and I see this as a this is that going back to that mixture of the practical realities, right? Do you become a great power by virtue of your economic power, your military abilities, but to be actually let's say admitted, respected, embraced as part of the international community as a great and important power depends on a variety of factors that
And the
sometimes
other,
seem unimportant. Go ahead.
yeah, actually, it's called legitimization of your position.
There you go.
And how long you will be legitimated, how long you will stay as an important player. If you end up in wars, as happened to Japan, you know, I mean, it
Hmm.
did very well for a short period, or Germany.
Right.
Japan did very well, you know, modernized since Meiji Restoration, less than 50 years, it became a great power. Ended up in wars and aggression and conquest, and nobody liked them. You know, even today, Koreans have tough time accepting Japanese, despite all their good things they've done to Southeast Asian countries over the years. So India doesn't need to follow that path at all. So how to remain there as a key pivotal player for the next 500 years without getting into wars, without getting into too much conquest. Of course, there will be some conflicts. And that will be possible only if you have both hard and soft power and
Hmm.
the latest technologies of the day, but without being aggressive about it. Of course, you need deterrence as well as defense. But if your aim is to conquer or dominate or change the status quo forcefully, others will gang up on you, as China is slowly experiencing that. And
See
it,
that, and I like this point, right? The issue
mm,
that China's peaceful rise for 30 years, or
mm,
almost 30 years,
mm.
had led to the Xi Jinping government with a degree of hubris that's decided to behave much more aggressively, which may actually be creating more resistance to China's rise than existed before.
I agree completely. I'm actually a big fan of Deng Xiaoping. He's the one who said, lie low as long as
Hmm.
you can. Of course, he tells that at some point he may have to rise up.
I mean,
China could do a
yeah.
lot more to be a responsible power.
Hmm.
China could, first of all, this South China Sea thing is really not a smart thing,
Hmm.
making so many enemies and contesting the international law about the law of the sea in particular, even though they haven't signed it. So
Hmm.
China wants international law, but only those parts that really it wants to help its rise. If China is careful with India, by the way, if China doesn't poke on the Indian border, this so-called salami slicing strategy,
Hmm.
China could be very friendly with India. I mean, that's what
Hmm.
happened before Xi Jinping. They were going to these meetings, and China has to share some of these status aspirations that India has, such
Hmm.
as allowing joining Security Council membership, because India supported China regaining the Security Council seat, which people believe that it was offered to India, Nehru's India, by United States. But Nehru said, no, China deserves it. It shouldn't be taken away. And so there are a lot of things India did for China in that soft power way. But China has this tendency to look down upon India as a country of insignificance. And the
Hmm.
more I read about this new book I mentioned, talks about the contribution India has made to China, not
Hmm.
vice versa, and
Right.
Japan in the religious, in the Buddhist and other ideas. And but the problem is communists don't like these ideologies, religious ideas that spread to China from India. They want muscular ideas. But the point is that China has made a big mistake by going in the authoritarian route for the economic reasons. The growth rate has come down. Of course, they are stimulating, but the more sanctions will come, more tariffs. And
Hmm.
so how can China rise without a violent conflict? If it can somehow wait it out, improve its economic status, and automatically it will gain a lot of power, a civilian power, an important player. But right now, China has gone back to its communist kind of nationalistic route. It's not even communist, which means no one can go there. You have to be afraid to go travel. You could be in jail, that kind of China doesn't need that.
No.
China should engage the world and become part of the world, just like India should do that too. So both these countries and Russia too need a re-education that this old idea of great power club and domination, the European battles, shouldn't be promoting. They should develop a new set of norms and ideas for the
It's interesting. Of course, this would be a subject for another time, but it is interesting that the Europeans themselves have embraced have moved away from these ideas. In fact, the Americans find themselves having to constantly push the Europeans to try to think more in hard power terms to deal with these issues. Whereas, ironically, right, the lessons of the 17th and 18th century are being learned other places, perhaps to their detriment. There's so much more we could talk about. There was a very good question came in from Chris Colianese just as in the last minutes here about that India almost cooperated with the United States in the occupation of Iraq, but pulled back because it didn't want to get involved in such kind of international military operations. If I take what you're saying is that the Indians need to continue to avoid getting involved in military action if they can.
they can,
But
yeah.
can they do that and while maintaining their sense of national strength and deterrence and their ability to protect their own sovereignty? I guess that's the challenge.
Some conflicts like Taiwan will be a big testing one if
Hmm.
at all it happens, what India would do. But my reading is that India will provide ancillary secondary support. India
Mm-hmm.
definitely don't want to see Taiwan forcefully occupied,
Right.
and that it will upset the whole regional order or affect Japan's security. So India has positioned something it can do, but direct participation, I don't know. And the other
Mm-hmm.
question is Indians ask, if the Chinese attack, will the West come to its rescue? Doubtful. So a lot of these questions we're going to see in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well, and there's so much more to talk about, but we're just about at the end of our hour, and I think that's a good way to end this conversation. TV Paul, thanks so much for joining us on People, Politics, and Prose. Ladies and gentlemen, The Unfinished Quest is available in bookstores now from Oxford University Press. I encourage you to check it out. There is much to be learned about India. And Professor TV Paul, we thank you for being with us today on People, Politics, and Prose.
Thank you for having me and a great conversation. You are very good at it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. FPRI thanks its sponsors and partners for their generous support in making shows like this possible. And we ask you that if you have enjoyed this conversation to consider becoming a supporter, a partner, a friend of FPRI. If you enjoyed this conversation, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time as we will continue to meet to talk about our complex world, because today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will talk about it at FPRI. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other programs at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on X, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program. I just said X and Twitter. Follow us on Facebook. Like us on X. You can follow the host of this program on X at Ronald Graneri. I'm always interested in hearing from you, and I look forward to welcoming you to future conversations. But until next time, with thanks to all of my colleagues at FPRI for making this possible and for all of you for making it possible, I'm Ron Graneri. Thanks for joining us.